interesting pattern around kind of when people mobilize and also what demobilizes people and how lasting mobilization is. There's like a bunch of questions in there that I think are relevant to the pandemic and to the uprising of 2020, because both prompted like big expansions in mutual aid. Like, you know, the uprising prompted tons of stuff around bail funds and tons of people doing on the ground mutual aid at different kinds of like occupation or encampments in their towns, or more people having an awareness about police violence and then being more interested in like helping defend against sweeps of homeless encampments. Or there's a lot of bleed over between the kinds of vulnerability people that were expanded during COVID, the long-term vulnerability that's existed in targeted ways, and the ways people got politicized or like wanted to do new things they hadn't done before related to the uprising. Like, I feel like there's many sort of avenues of mobilization happening. And so I see a number of things happening. You know, one part of it is that moments of awakening like that, a lot of people will go back to their habits. So it still matters, I think, a lot if people went out and fought the cops in the streets some in June 2020, even if they're not still out doing that. Or it matters if some people joined a mutual aid project for a while or something popped off for them, even if they stopped. So something I do see happening is that some mutual aid projects that are really necessary are down to a skeleton crew. Like in some places, I think one of the most important kinds of mutual aid that we've seen expanding in the US in the last few years has been support for unhoused people. Both people doing like, you know, supporting encampments, like bringing people water and charging stations for their devices and food and distributing tents, and also people trying to support folks when the cops are going to sweep the encampment, help people move. And there's been some moments where people have tried to stop the cops from actually doing a sweep, like in Echo Park in March 2021, you know, thousands of people turned out to try to stop the cops from sweeping this really pretty developed encampment in Echo Park where people had like solar showers and were like doing gardening, and where there was like some really amazing mutual aid happening for the long term. And the sweeps had been held off for about a year and a half. And then city of LA, you know, decided to go ahead and spend over $1 million and sweep the park and put a fence all around the outside of the park. But that was a moment where I was like, maybe people are going to stop this sweep, you know, kind of that level of bold mutual aid where it's like we get between each other and the cops. So one of my questions, of course, is like, when there are a lot of people mobilized and then there's less people mobilized, or some people, you know, get exhausted or have to go back to different parts of their life and stop being part of mutual aid efforts they were part of, like, how do we bring them back in? How can we take what they got to learn about what felt amazing about being part of collective action and keep going with it? I'm interested in what demobilizes us, like not just burnout. I mean, I think we should talk about burnout, but also like things like people being swept into electoral campaigns, people being like, the next step of this, if I was engaged with mutual aid, the thing I should do now is I should focus on trying to get these progressive candidates in, and the ways in which that can be like a redirection of people's energies away from building like autonomous power and survivability towards getting something out of the system. And does it have to be that way? Is there a way that we could not lose so many people to that and to that promise that the answers will come from electeds, which I think it's pretty clear they're not going to. I mean, I think there can be reasons strategically to try to get certain people into certain offices, but we can't stop doing the mutual aid work under these conditions. And so I get concerned about that to some degree. I think the burnout piece is really complex. I have a lot of conversations with people about this. I'll just say a few pieces that I think are significant. One is, I think it's always useful to ask ourselves, what do we mean by burnout? Like, for some people, burnout is that I was in a mutual aid group or some kind of political group and there was a lot of conflict, and now I feel it was unresolved for me, or I felt loss of trust or loss of belonging, or I felt blamed or called out. And the burnout can be like this unresolved stuff around conflict, or people use the word toxic. Like, that can be one kind of burnout. There can be burnout that's like literal exhaustion, but I think that it's like, there's usually something more to it. Like, being exhausted is something that you can rest from and recover from. Burnout usually means I went way past my boundaries, or I deeply believed I wasn't good enough unless I did more than I could do. Like, there's usually some deeper emotional dynamics that I think are worth all of us looking at. So we can ask ourselves, like, well, how do I recover from that? How do I prevent that next time? Why was I vulnerable to that? What would need to be different about conflict in groups I'm in? What kind of values would I want groups I'm in to have about conflicts that would make that not happen next time? What would I need to believe about myself to be in this work and take better care of myself and find those moments of balance and rest. Like, and I just speak about these are kinds of burnouts I've experienced. Like, just how do I not just be like, I'm burnt out, end of story, but instead, like, what is there to be learned about how I want to participate in groups, what I'm bringing in from cultural programming or for programming my family and things like that, that might make me vulnerable to being super overextended or getting hurt by doing this work, and what would I want the internal culture of groups I'm in to be to prevent some of those repeated patterns. So that's like sort of one whole piece of it for me, an inquiry we can have that's not just like I throw up my hands, I'm burnt out, but instead kind of like, so what do we do with that? This is something a lot of people are complaining of. This must be a collective problem we all have, or a set of collective problems. And the next thing is, people often say, like, you know, because I'm encouraging people to do mutual aid and that it is like unpaid work. I'm like, yes, we all need to be doing unpaid mutual aid work to make the new world, just to have any of us survive the conditions now, to try to reduce suffering with what's going on now. People are like, are you kidding me? Like, I have to work 2 jobs. We've got kids, you know, people have a lot going on. And so then that question is like, it can't be that it's just impossible, because social movements have always been the work of people who were living in the worst conditions. That's why they put it all on the line and took huge, bold risks, because they were living under the worst conditions. Like, social movement work is not something done by people who like have a leisurely life. It's always the most bold and risky and dangerous action is always done by those who are already in the worst conditions. And so it must be that it's not impossible to be under really hard conditions and do social movement work. In fact, that's what usually happens. So then I think the question becomes like, what are the ways the conditions that have been created for us right now make it so hard to do the work? And I think a lot of that is isolation.